But we're going to be talking about key trends in managing applications for financial services. So, in this particular presentation, we have actually a packed agenda. And when we look at all the items I'm going to talk about today, first of all, I'm just going to set the scene and talk about some of the financial use cases which we see where application services can benefit financial organizations, and also the variety of them. Then we're going to go into the main guts of the presentation and talk about multi-cloud adoption, how a polynimber strategy can help organizations. But then we're going to go into some very specific data for financial services around low latency trading. We have a little case study in here, and then some fairly fresh survey data from a couple of months ago, talking about some of the trends, especially in this COVID 19 era, and how that's actually changing some of the decisions which are being made for application services. So without further ado, let's move on. And when we look at the financial use cases which application services service, for lack of a better word, they're very broad out there. So, for example, we can have things which are fairly simple, which is making sure that web-based online banking is highly available and secure. Then there's emerging use cases. So, for example, fintech applications for micro payments running in the cloud, maybe using some of the more modern technologies out there, such as containers running maybe in AWS or Alibaba, etc. Then we have some which are totally different from these types of use cases, and I'll talk more about this one later. So, for example, low latency fixed protocol, both load balancing and also just making sure it gets routed to the right place based on certain fixed protocol headers. Then there was one use case which one particular customer we were talking to had, which was outside of the US, but it was interesting. They actually had an ATM network which was responding very slowly. And so customers couldn't always be guaranteed they get money out. So some of these application services on the back end were essentially failing, even if they were intermittent. And they had to put in more reliable solutions to be able to make sure that people got their money when they went to the ATM. So a bit more of an extreme example, but there's those type of applications out there as well. Then one of the ones we'll talk about a little bit later on is also about DDoS downtime, because that one does seem to be top of mind, especially from some of the survey results. So basically, when we look at all these use cases, they're very broad, but they're also very specific. Now, going into the main backdrop of this presentation, we're really talking about cloud, right? And one of the surveys we did, which wasn't financial services specific, even though it did include organizations who were financial services, is a study which was done with the BPI network, which asked how many clouds were you using? So not with on-prem and not being included in that. So when we actually looked at this data, you can see the majority of the respondents were using two or more clouds. So today, that's not really that much of a surprise with the environments which are out there and the changes over the last few years. However, one thing which was interesting from this survey was only 11% of the respondents thought they were highly successful. So there's obviously some things going on here. And when we look at those, is probably some of the things you're quite familiar with if you're running an IT organization, no matter what type of industry you're in, which is basically the issues around security, the lack of IT talent, or maybe talent which is very specifically focused on one type of technology, or it might not be adept in 5 different cloud operating systems, which actually makes sense when you think about the complexity. So it really comes down to that word, which is really complexity of these environments. And I think that is why we get this 11% number. So really the question is, how do we manage a multi-cloud world more effectively? And this is really where these application services come in to help the applications thrive out there. So when we look at the state of adoption of the cloud technologies out there, we were at a phase, over the last few years. Probably, I remember like a conversation that we had 8 years ago with one particular organization, and they were implementing some technology in, I think it was AWS at the time. And we asked them, okay, how come you're implementing the technology in the cloud instead of your local data center? And the answer came back is because management told us to do so, and we want to look like we're in the cloud. So there were some of these early use cases, which were really just let's almost like experimenting with the technology without a clear business goal, which isn't always the best thing to do. But then again, it did get people on the start of their journey to the cloud. And really, I think these types of examples are really. I mean, there's probably still a few examples out there, but they've largely disappeared. And we're basically in this phase which requires mainstreaming and efficiency when it comes to these cloud types of environments. And when we look at the different types of considerations here, organizations are trying to meet their roadmaps for digital transformation, and that might be to become more efficient with their IT organization. It might be to deploy new services, which can be enabled in the cloud and spun up quicker, etc. But there's multiple different reasons. But ultimately, it's trying to align to those business realities they have out there. Now, the other thing is the other goal, which we believe is that we want to try and reduce that complexity and cost at all costs, for lack of a better wording there. But the idea of that is, as the increased adoption of these different multi-cloud technologies has happened, the number of staff who is supporting them hasn't necessarily increased, right? If it has for you, then you might be lucky out there. But the basic being able to automate, maximize staff, and reduce complexity is key, especially when we look at the financial services organizations in general. They often have more strict mandates around compliance, for their applications, where the data is held, etc. So being able to do this efficiently across multiple cloud platforms which enable you to deliver the applications out there is one of those critical items, but really about reducing complexity at the end of the day. Now, when people look at deploying applications to the cloud, there's new ways of looking at multiple different components which make up these application services. So in this multi-cloud environment, you have to look very carefully at those services which are supporting your applications. Now, if you take, say, AWS, you take Oracle, you take all these different types of cloud solutions out there, they might have different web application firewalls. They might have different load balancing solutions. So this is where some of that complexity comes in. What about licensing schemes? What about centralized visibility? If someone comes to you and say, hey, how is my website X performing, right? If you have to go to 5 different people or 5 different consoles to get that information, it is more difficult. So reducing that complexity across the board, whether it's licensing, whether it's having a consistent application stack for compliance, whatever it might be, is key. So this is where this Polynimbus Secure Application Services blueprint comes in. Now, when we look at the application delivery controller, this is the evolution of the load balancer, which provides essential application services in a multi-cloud environment. So over the years, and this you can actually probably see this in other industries or other technologies as well. We move from physical appliances to virtual to cloud, and now we're in this multi-cloud world. But really, there's one more step on the evolution not everyone's talking about right now, which is what we call Polynimbus, which really means many clouds. Doesn't replace multi-cloud, but basically is more reflective of the world we're living in, where you have to manage not just one of these, but all of these at the same time. So you've probably still got your data center, for certain applications, and then you've also got cloud data centers, say using AWS or Microsoft Azure or Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, whatever it might be. And when we look at the application delivery controller, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but basically it provides availability, optimization, and security for the applications out there, whether it's providing encrypted traffic, load balancing in case of some application fails on the back end and redirects the traffic, or with the supporting pieces of it to be able to give you visibility and orchestration of what's going on with your websites, or maybe views for the developers if they're using CI/CD pipelines, etc., to push out content. And this one's probably a little bit more complicated, but if you look at number 1 here, this shows a simple application delivery controller in front of a couple of different applications, and it might be doing load balancing at number 1 in the diagram. If we look at number 2, if you move into this multi-cloud world and say you've got a data center in Asia as well as the European one, you might want to shift people between those data centers depending on the latency or just if there's a failover. So having global server load balancing to do that is essential. Then number three, you might want to be able to have visibility across all three of these data center or regions, say a public cloud in Asia, the North America data center, and another data center in Europe. So taking that concept of Polynimbus to be able to have a view across the multi-cloud environment, and that consistency is what we're talking about here. Now, I'm just going to briefly touch on one of these use cases because the load balancing and application delivery side of it is one of those obvious areas for application services. But there's also many different use cases which are out there and very specific ones, as I mentioned earlier. So fixed trading is one of those ones which is very suited for your own environments versus a cloud environment. Because again, some of these use cases are very specific. And in this one particular example, it marries multiple different technologies to be able to get the requirements completed. So in this particular example, we had an organization who wanted to reduce the latency for their fix trading application, and they wanted to route the traffic based on the comp ID, which was one of the fields within the fix protocol, to particular servers. Now, some of the flexibility you can have in this example is you can use the comp ID, which is a unique identifier for an organization, say the center comp ID, to redirect particular traffic to one server. Maybe it's a faster server which processes things more quickly, or you can spread it around to basically get more efficiencies of scale with the equipment you have. And you can also weight the servers so you can still use existing equipment. In this particular example, in their trading environment, they basically measured the latency, and they actually got 4x less latency by going to a new technology. But the key thing here was to basically do detailed testing of the different solutions which are out there to make sure and measure it to make sure that they could get that type of performance. And different technologies do different things. In this example, they used one without an FPGA, which is one of those technologies or hardware technologies which can help accelerate things. Other environments might want even lower latency. So certain technologies such as FPGAs can help those application services. Now, I'm just very quickly going to head through a couple of slides as promised on the application delivery trends. So in June, this survey was released from Gatepoint Research, and they had some very specific data, all for financial services, not for other verticals out there. Now, one of the interesting things, one of the first questions was, how has traffic changed within this COVID because of COVID-19? And what you can see here is 47% of organizations realized their application traffic increased. So this is one of those things which is good to know because you have to build in capacity into your environment to be able to account for that. Another one is what benefits do you consider most important when funding new technology? And I've highlighted a couple of things on a few of these slides. So no surprise that enhanced security came in. But if you can see, there's probably a few more than we expected answers basically going around cost savings, which is probably no surprise in this area because organizations are looking at how they can reduce costs. So this is probably a little bit higher than we would normally see in a non-COVID environment. And I've also talked to a few analysts about this, and they seem to be confirming that as well. Now, another one is, what were the biggest security concerns, which obviously leads on from the top answer in the last one. So there's no surprise on this. In financial services, we typically see things which are around the consumer and things such as phishing and ransomware and malicious code and theft of personally identifiable information. What was interesting was the middle three here, because these ones were all around DDoS protection. So another thing with when we look at financial services, they're worried about brand damage, the sites being taken down because of DDoS attacks. Especially over the last few years, we've seen an increase in bot-based attacks, etc. Now, going specifically to the subject matter for this presentation, one of the questions we also asked was, what capabilities do you think are most important for financial services running in hybrid cloud? So, unlike some of the other verticals which we serve, for example, e-commerce, regulatory compliance comes in at number one. But if you look at all the other three I highlighted, these are all around those polynimbus type items I talked about earlier, which is being able to accommodate cloud-based environments, redundancy and disaster recovery between clouds, comprehensive application security, and centralized management analytics. Now, one thing which was interesting, which doesn't really surprise me, is at the end, but with these application services, flexible licensing and pricing came in last. But this is because I think a lot of organizations aren't necessarily aware that they can get this. So when you look at your application services in the cloud, make sure your licenses are portable between those clouds. So you don't have to buy a new license for each software instance you have when you move it. Now, one of the other ones was we asked, what do you expect to implement or technologies do you think you're going to be implementing? So what's interesting is the top two in here are around software and scale out. So that fits with this cloud theme we're talking about. And then some of the other ones, if you look at the third one, this is around encryption. This one we used to see a lot higher, but I think it's because a lot of organizations have implemented stricter SSL offloading technologies and encryption standards around perfect forward secrecy and elliptical curve over the last few years. Now, interestingly, the bottom one on here, cloud repatriation. So not every application is designed for the cloud. Now, it's not a trend that everyone's moving their applications from cloud back to on-premise, but there are certain use cases where it makes sense. For example, that fixed one I talked about earlier. Now I'm just going to wrap up on here because we're running out of time. So if you want to know more about A10, we deliver secure application services such as application delivery, load balancing. We also provide DDoS protections to some of the largest organizations out there. You can see many well-known financial names on here, and also some of the biggest names in technology who use us around the world. And we also have a survey which we do every year or two with our customers. And here's some of the results talking about the ROI and the consolidation out there. And these are typically customers who have migrated from other platforms. Now, just to wrap it up, because I'm probably a little bit over, we have some additional reading which we can provide to you afterwards, which is basically quite a lot of the data which is provided in this and other reports. So, for example, the Gatepoint research and also a white paper from SDX Central and some other organizations as well. So, with that, I'll hand it back to you because I'm a little bit over time there.
Okay, great. All right, great, Paul. Thank you very much. You are running indeed a little over, but I want to to advise everyone that there is in fact an A10 breakout room, and please do join it so that you can have the opportunity to ask any additional questions. We do have time for just one question. And Paul, some of our customers' transactions need to happen almost instantly. Writes this anonymous questioner. Won't turning on SSL encryption, i.e., inspecting encrypted traffic, slow that down?
So one of the things we always say is always test things in your environment, right? Encryption is something you can't do without, so you have to turn it on if you're outside of your own network, if you're dealing with web properties, etc. Typically, the impact of that is negligible. Most users wouldn't notice it if they're using a banking site, etc. If you go to those low latency environments, encryption may be used, but it might be used in a different way. But there's specific platforms which can be faster than other platforms. So in that low latency example I gave, they used one low latency platform, but there was a lower latency one, which obviously is more expensive because there's different technology inside, including hardware, which can accelerate that. So it really depends on deploying it, but the bottom line is really test it to make sure it meets your needs and the latency you can expect, and also test for jitter, i.e., the variance in that delay as well, especially in those low latency trading
just to
environments.
sum up, it probably won't in a standard human environment, but it might in a system-to-system environment like a trading
Correct.
floor.
Yeah.
Your best bet is to test it. Okay, great. Sorry, Paul, I have to cut you off.